Salafism is growing fast in the UK. In fact, it's possible that it may be the fastest growing Muslim faction in the UK. One estimate puts the number of Salafi mosques at about 9% of the total in the UK, and new mosques are opening all the time. And increasingly, women as well as men are practicing this highly conservative version of Islam that many associate with countries far away, like Saudi Arabia. And yet what's interesting is that the followers here in the UK are overwhelmingly not first-generation Muslim immigrants or visitors to the UK. They are the sons, the daughters, the grandchildren of this first generation. And not only that, there are many from non-Muslim backgrounds as well. I would argue that Salafism in the UK is distinctive for its diversity. In the course of my research, I've met people from all kinds of backgrounds, including Afro-Caribbean Christian converts, West African converts, the odd white convert. I've met people from Polish, Colombian, Spanish, French, Belgian Catholic backgrounds. I've met people of various mixed ethnicities and backgrounds in terms of religion. And I've met ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and even a former Catholic nun and a Sikh convert. So really there is no limit to the kind of diversity I feel I've seen over the course of my research. Now, these are some general observations, but there are no precise figures or demographics on Salafis in the UK. They are a hard-to-reach community, and there's no Salafi membership form. But I think we can be sure of at least two things. The first is that UK Salafi groups are not going away anytime soon. They're here to stay, at least for the medium term, I would say. And secondly, they consist overwhelmingly of British people. So love them or loathe them, they need to be properly understood as part of the British Muslim landscape today. And for that reason, I'm very pleased to have been invited to this excellent conference this year. And that means that we need reliable, empirical information about Salafi groups, just as we do with any other group. But the trouble is, when it comes to Salafis, most of what we read and hear, and especially about Salafi women, is not based on rigorous first-hand data, but is instead superficial, second-hand, and typically influenced by sectarian or political agendas. And rarely, of course, do we actually hear the voices of Salafi women themselves. So that's why I set out to document Salafi women's ordinary lives through first-hand research. And my resulting book, The Making of a Salafi Muslim Woman, is the first in-depth study of Salafi women in the UK. I immersed myself in the life of the community as much as I possibly could for nearly 2.5 years. In London. And during that time, I spoke to hundreds of women, mostly young women, and formally interviewed 23 of them in depth, and also 13 of their leaders. I went to their religious lectures and their study circles, of course, but I also did kind of the ordinary daily activities as well, picking up kids from school, going to social gatherings, going to a fried chicken shop, all sorts of ordinary kinds of activities. So a combination of participating on the one hand and also observation in a detached way as well. So that's why the research method is called participant observation. It's not the same at all as going native. I often get asked or indirectly asked, am I a secret convert to Islam or Salafism? I'm not Salafi and I'm not Muslim, and I've never pretended to be either, which has also happened in this field as well. And what I found in my research was a sharp contrast with the image of Salafi women and niqabis, women who wear niqab, face veils, that's been constructed and largely accepted since 9/11. I say Salafi women and niqabis because, of course, the media and mainstream politics doesn't always differentiate between Salafis and niqabis, but I accept, of course, there are many women who wear niqab who do not identify as Salafi. So I think you're probably all familiar with the kind of stereotype I'm talking about. And what's interesting is if you look at it closely and dissect it, I think you can find it's full of contradictions. It mixes zealous activism on the one hand with extreme passivity on the other. The kind of messages we're being sent on the passive side about fully veiled women could be summarized, I think, and I'm going to exaggerate slightly for effect, could be summarized like this. Can I have a slide change? She's forced into restrictive garments and the ideology behind it by male clerics and family members. She's incarcerated in a prison of polyester, which conceals the scars of constant beatings by her husband and prevents her from engaging with society. Her oppressed life behind closed doors revolves entirely around draconian, misogynistic rules and an insular cultish community. We're often simultaneously told that she's a willing participant in a sinister, secretive, possibly violent subculture. She's unwilling to engage with society because she despises the West, the dirty kuffar, and anyone who doesn't sign up to her bigoted view of the world. She secretly supports ISIS, wants Sharia for the UK, and you never know she's got a bomb under that burqa. So what's going on here? Something doesn't quite add up. And if I could have a slide change, it sort of reminds me of a meme that a friend showed me recently called Schrodinger's Immigrant, about our perceptions of immigrants, where the immigrant is simultaneously a layabout scrounger and a job stealer at the same time. You can't be both. It doesn't add up. So I'm no fan of the niqab myself, but I wanted to get beyond these simplistic portrayals and understand why so many young women were embracing both the veil and Salafism. In summary, I discovered it was typically a personal religious choice made by British women who call Britain their home, they respect its laws, and they do not wish to harm it. But I also found that there are elements of intolerance and isolationism in Salafi preachings and occasionally behavior. But it's complicated, and I'm going to explain why. So taking this apart, starting with the active side of the stereotypes, I think I can go no longer without being clear what I mean by Salafism. Some people's definition will include groups like ISIS, so by definition it would be a violent group. The term is often used loosely, sometimes carelessly. Some people talk about Wahhabis as well, and of course Wahhabi is a pejorative term that insiders never or very rarely use. In its broadest sense, the term Salafi can apply to a whole spectrum of groups who claim to follow the authentic way of the Salaf, or the pious predecessors of Islam, often seen to be the first 3 generations of Muslims. It could cover liberals and ISIS supporters alike, because of course there are so many competing interpretations of what it means to be genuinely following the authentic Sunnah or the authentic Salaf example. But we can, of course, make some general observations about the modern-day Salafi movement. I think we can say it's known for a very strict and deferential interpretation of the scriptures. I say deferential, not literalist, because there's no such thing as a literalist interpretation. That you're always doing the interpreting, so I think literalist is misleading. And that interpretation tends to generate detailed religious rules and highly conservative practices, especially concerning women. And we can also say that most Salafis are non-violent. And in the British context, and let's focus on the British context, those who identify as Salafi tend to be quietist. They believe in peaceful dawah, or preaching, calling to Islam, as the only legitimate form of activism there is. You should avoid any politics, they say, any demonstrations for the most part. You've also got to obey the law of the land, and you shouldn't seek to impose or establish Sharia in the UK. In fact, these Salafi groups have been very vocal and active in their condemnation of jihadism over the years. And you've seen this especially after the recent terrorist attacks. They're often among the first at the scene with a dawah stall and anti-ISIS leaflets. Here you can see in Manchester, after the tragic events last summer, some Salafi guys handing out anti-ISIS leaflets in various parts of central Manchester. Now you can say this is opportunistic, this is out of self-interest, and you'd be absolutely right. But I still think that you could say such activism sends quite a powerful message at a time of fear and suspicion towards Muslims. These are the sorts of leaflets that they'll be handing out, quite striking. In terms of social integration, however, there are legitimate concerns, as I said, about some Salafis' isolation from the rest of society, intolerance and conservative practices, but with important caveats that are rarely stated. The charge that's usually leveled at Salafi communities, quietist communities, is that staple Salafi texts urge followers to hate disbelievers and avoid any friendships with anyone who's not Salafi, and effectively cut themselves off by necessity. Now, as a social scientist, I'm much more interested in what actually goes on in practice. It's one thing to be saying something in a book or online, but what do people actually do? How do thoughts get translated into, and readings get translated into actions? Well, I found that this attitude was occasionally echoed in the sermons and lessons that I attended in London over nearly 2.5 years. However, in nearly all cases, nearly all, not all, the remarks were heavily qualified in an important way, I believe, which is, you don't hate disbelievers, you hate the sin of disbelief. It was an important qualification because they would say the same of any sin. They would say you hate the sins of your fellow Salafi and you try to rectify it through gentle dawah. And they all stressed that you must treat everybody with kindness and good manners at all times, primarily because you want them to be called to the correct path, but also because of a common humanity. 2 more caveats. I found that it's an evolving picture. Some preachers are moving towards a more flexible Salafism. I met 2 preachers who told me that they now believed that Salafis should be involved and responsible citizens, and that it was a mistake to propagate, as I know for a fact at least one of them previously did, separation from non-Salafi society. The second caveat is the gap between the theory and practice, which I'm very interested in with my anthropology background. The women I spent time with, ordinary women now, not talking about the leaders, they often had non-Muslims as friends. They often had non-Salafi Muslims as friends. In fact, some of them had more non-Muslim friends than they had Muslim or Salafi friends, definitely Salafi friends, for reasons that will become apparent later to do with tensions in the Salafi sisterhood. And I found a similar gap between the theory and the practice in other areas of the women's lives as well. Some of them mixed with men. Some had secret boyfriends. Sometimes they would only tell me about it because I wouldn't judge them. So we shouldn't assume, is all I'm saying, that the highly conservative ideology in Salafi texts is replicated by ordinary British Salafis. So there are concerns, yes, on social integration, but it's a complicated and evolving picture, and also one that I would argue could be compared to other socially conservative groups in Britain today. You might have some in mind, but I like to compare, for example, the Orthodox Jews in Stamford Hill. So going on to the passive stereotype, and here the key question, I think, is, are women really free to be Salafis, to become Salafis, or are they forced or pressured in some way? Now, here are some different ways of asking that question that I've separated out here, and I'll go through these one by one. Are they vulnerable, naive, or uneducated? In the sense that if they are one of these things, you might argue that that is a reason for thinking that they are more gullible, more easily misled. Now, I have to say my overall impression, without having done a census of Salafis, is that they are quite an educated bunch, actually. Nearly all of my interviewees had been students or were already students, or else they were planning to go to university. Only one of them didn't meet one of those criteria. And they all wanted careers, apart from that one individual who wanted to be a housewife. All the others wanted to be wives and mothers, yes, but they also wanted fulfilling careers. I also found them to be quite articulate, my sort of general impression talking to these women, quite articulate, assertive, feisty even in conversation. And you could argue as well, you have to be quite brave to wear a niqab every day and face the insults and abuse that you do. Were they brainwashed by charismatic recruiters then? Well, on this I have to say the women were all very, very different. They had different backgrounds, different paths to conversion, so it's difficult I can't really generalize, but they all articulated rational motivations and deliberations. They explained their main motivation to me in this way. And if I could change the slide, I simplified this radically to save time in my own words, but this was basically the logical argument they made to me. Premise number 1, God only rewards you if you do just what he's instructed you to do. 2, God's instructions can only be found in the Quran and the Sunnah. 3, unlike any other Muslim groups, Salafism, its texts, its preachers, its followers, propagates only what's plainly does a lot of work there, in the Quran and Sunnah. So what they meant by that was things like Salafi groups, they said, didn't promote cultural practices from first generation's countries of origin, such as maybe their parents celebrated the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, or something like that. And likewise, they wouldn't integrate with Western cultures, such as celebrating birthdays just for the sake of it, unless it was explicitly endorsed by the Quran and Sunnah, or by a scholar of high status as well. And if you add up these 3 premises, you can logically deduce, they would say, that only by following Salafism can you be certain that you're upon pure, authentic Islam, and consequently that you'll go to paradise after you die. Understood in this way, the women would say to me, well, Anabel, it just makes sense, doesn't it? It just makes sense to follow Salafism. Why would you do anything else? And I've witnessed for myself how Salafi preachers convey this sense of simplicity and authenticity to great effect. At every single lesson I attended, the teachers rarely strayed from quoting the Quran, paraphrasing the scriptures in some way, or also famous Islamic scholars. They would rarely stray from those sources. The phrase, "I think," is banned from the Salafi teacher's lexicon. You lose credibility if you use it, so you don't tend to hear it. But far from making them charismatic preachers that were impossible to resist, I found it actually made for rather tedious classes. As somebody who sat in plenty of these classes over the years, I wondered at first, how did these preachers gain a significant following? But then I got to know the women, and I discovered they were very wary of being fooled. Many of them had experimented in their Islamic journey with different versions of Islam or even other religions. Salafi teachers encouraged their students to challenge them, ask them for explicit proofs in the scriptures for what they were teaching. And then the idea was that students could then go and verify it. They could go online and find even very obscure hadiths in English, as you can these days. So Salafi's obsession with tying everything to scripture, and a very narrow, deferential interpretation of scripture at that, gave the women the reassuring certainty that they'd found true Islam. And there are various other reasons for their conversion as well, which I can go into later if you like. But moving on, because I'll run out of time. Next slide. Were they pressured into it by their families? Well, most of the women I spoke to were unmarried. So husbands hadn't played a role in their conversion, and I found that they tended to find suitors after becoming Salafis. Nearly all of them were from families who saw the niqab and Salafi lifestyle as alien and even abhorrent. Those from Muslim families had parents who maybe followed the 5 pillars, maybe, but not much else. Some mothers wore hijab, but all saw the niqab as just unnecessary, rooted in Arabic culture, nothing to do with our family, and maybe an indicator of extremism, worrying extremism. Far from being forced by their families to cover up, I found that the young women were typically pressured into wearing less. Parents would implore their daughters to discard their gowns and their niqabs. They were concerned about their daughter's safety, very legitimate concerns. You know, is my daughter going to come home at night, or is she going to get attacked on the street? There were cases of violence or threats of violence in a minority of cases made by parents against their own daughters. And you can imagine the reactions could be even more dramatic in the case of those from non-Muslim background, because Islam alone was quite alien, let alone this kind of Islam. Hiding your niqab wearing from your parents was quite common in Salafi communities. I call it secret niqab habits, and a lot of people do it. So a complete reversal of the familiar scenario of teenage daughter who's scolded by her parents for wearing a miniskirt and a crop top and putting on makeup. Is something more like this, if I could have a slide change. This cartoon, sort of in a very exaggerated way, sums up what I'm talking about here. But what about pressures from within the group? If I could have one more slide change. Anti-cultists sometimes talk about a tactic recruiters use called love bombing, where they overwhelm someone with love and affection so that you have this idea that your emotional needs will be met by the group and they're harder to resist. Well, actually, I found, as I hinted earlier, that many women felt estranged from fellow Salafis and really struggled to make friends, actually. The women were quite frank with me once I repeatedly reassured them about anonymity, confidentiality, about the judgmental and cliquey atmosphere that pervades many Salafi groups. There was an abrasive culture of refutation. Where's your proof for that, sis? Where's your dalil? That scholar's on bid'ah. He's refuted. Why are you listening to his sermons? This kind of thing. It generated constant monitoring within the community. What you wear, how much makeup, what websites you visit, what lectures you attend, whose halakas you go to, all will be policed by your fellow sisters. To give you an example, slide change please. Manal, in her mid-20s of Eritrean background, she was talking to me about when she first started going to a Salafi mosque at Brixton. She said she was judged by Afro-Caribbean converts there for wearing makeup and for not wearing a full black jilbab. She said, I wanted sisterhood so bad, and I didn't get it. They were really rude. It's very cliquey, and if you're not in, you're not in. And if you don't look a certain way, if you're not covered in a certain way, then you're not in. This meant that conversion often occurred despite relations with the group rather than because of them. Few of the women had already formed solid and lasting friendships at the point where they became Salafi. And some were actually put off for quite some time because of negative encounters with judgmental Salafi women. One more slide change. So these difficulties combined with never-ending dilemmas in their daily lives as they try to reconcile strict Salafi teachings with their desire for a higher education, rewarding career and happy marriage. Consequently, women's faith and religious practice could be rather fragile. It could be quite zigzaggy at times. It could go up and down. Lapses were very common. Skipping mosque classes, moderating your dress. Sometimes these lapses would turn into long absences, and you'd hear very occasionally that so-and-so's got pregnant outside of wedlock, or so-and-so no longer covers herself. So just as they'd chosen to convert into Salafism, they could equally choose to disobey or even drift away from it, as many do. My research revealed fundamentally a gap between the pristine, the black and white, the inflexible system that's portrayed both by, I think, Salafi preachers and the media, and the dynamic, developing, and disobedient, lived Salafism of its ordinary adherent. So that's just something I think is useful to keep in mind when we read alarmist reports and portrayals on Salafi women and niqabis in the UK. Thanks very much for your attention.